Hello and welcome to the LLG Grapevine podcast. You're listening to Helen McGrath, Head of Public Affairs, and Dennis Hall, LLG Bulletin Editor.
Hello everyone.
Now, hot off the press and undigested as yet is the government's publication of the school's white paper, which introduces a number of concepts to make sure every child can reach their full potential. Plans include a minimum school week, Ofsted inspections of all schools by 2025, multi-academy trust conversion in progress or taking place by 2030, and 100 million education endowment fund. LLG will report more on that as we go along. Now, Dennis, the big news last week was the government's response to the report on standards reform. LLG have put out a brief guide to the response, but what are your reflections a week later?
Well, Helen, this has been a mixed bag of disappointments, but also some positive recognition in government circles at last that reform is needed to properly protect monitoring officers from undue influence as they go about their work. Here's my analysis. This was a curious thing. Late on the other Friday, Comic Relief Day, indeed late afternoon, we saw much activity on the issue of standards and local government. First came the unexpected announcement from government, then comments from the LGA, and finally a response from Lord Evans, chair of the Committee on Standards in Public Life. Never have I seen in the latter case such deep disappointment expressed so mildly. So why all this? Well, government has just rejected the flagship recommendation by the CSPL in their major report in 2019 that local authorities should be able to suspend councillors without allowances for up to 6 months for breaches of their codes of conduct. After a wait of 3 years, most of the committee's careful recommendations, as Lord Evans called them, were rejected outright. NALC, the organisation representing parish councillors, summed up what many in our sector will be thinking. Councillor Keith Stevens, NALC chair, said that he was bitterly disappointed by the government's light-touch, totally inadequate response to the CSPL report on local government standards. It will do nothing to stamp out poor behaviour in councils at all levels where it exists. He said, coming after 3 years since the committee published its thorough 110-page report, the government's 12-page response simply failed to properly address its recommendations and dismissed nearly all of them. However, a real silver lining did emerge out of all of this, and it involves LLG's key role in the pursuit of statutory reforms. Recent years have seen LLG being proactive on the national stage in pursuing a number of effective campaigns for major reform. And in this instance, LLG's own campaign for stronger protections for monitoring officers was wholeheartedly accepted by the government. They now recognise, as we do, that the conduct of major investigations may expose MOs to the risks of disciplinary steps to bring pressures upon them. In her letter, Kemi Badenoch made it clear that MOs will get more statutory protections, and she is keen to work with sector representatives to introduce new provisions. As a result of this successful campaign, you can expect that LLG will be front and centre of the work to amend the relevant statutory provisions. But back to those reform proposals that concern member behaviour. Until the system for regulating member misconduct includes effective sanctions, the proper governance of member standards and ethics remains unfinished business and looks set to remain so for many, many years to come. Of course, observers already know that this is not a government that was ever likely to take ethics and standards very seriously, as this response to our sector perfectly demonstrates. So I'm not surprised at the belated outcome to the main recommendations in Lord Evans' report. After all, it was Red Nose Day when the announcement was made. Not a day to be taking anything too seriously.
Well, Dennis, the government's response in respect of statutory protection mirrors closely our written response to the committee back when it was published in 2019. So we really are elated that protection will be forthcoming. And all is not lost in respect of standards, as there does remain a commitment to engage with sector representatives to seek views on options to strengthen sanctions to address breaches of the code, which fall below the bar of criminal activity and related sanctions, but involve serious incidents of bullying and harassment or disruptive behaviour, so I'm retaining my optimism for now. Sticking with the Committee on Standards in Public Life, Lord True, Minister of State at the Cabinet Office, has replied to Lord Evans' letter to the Prime Minister about the committee's review on the role of leadership in embedding the principles of public life in public sector organisations. In it, he thanked Lord Evans for his letter of the 22nd of February in respect of their review, Leading in Practice, pledging a commitment to ethical standards and importance of strong leadership in embedding the 7 principles of public life. He looked forward to the review next year and to working with the committee. Of note to me, at least, was the fact that Lord True had personally written a sentence at the end, looking forward to a conversation shortly, a personal element which I took to be a sign for future engagement. In other news, I see that the government are intending to legislate to give new housing powers to councils. What's the news?
Yes, it emerged last week in parliamentary written questions that councils will get new powers to control landlords of supported housing who fail to meet the expected standards. Here's my briefing. The Minister for Rough Sleeping and Housing, yes, that's his actual designation, said last week that councils are to be given new powers to tackle unregulated supported housing and the minority of landlords who charge high rents for poor quality accommodation. In a written ministerial statement, Eddie Hughes said the government intended to bring forward measures to put an end to unscrupulous landlords exploiting some of the most vulnerable in our society. He added, "We have no intention of penalising those providers who operate responsibly. We are clear that measures must be as targeted and proportionate as possible to protect supply of housing across the board. The package of measures is expected to include minimum standards for the support that is provided to residents, to ensure that residents receive the good quality support they expect and deserve in order to live as independently as possible and achieve their personal ambitions. There will be new powers for local authorities in England to better manage their local supported housing market and ensure that rogue landlords cannot exploit the system to the detriment of vulnerable residents and at the expense of taxpayers. And changes will be made to housing benefit regulations to seek to define care, support and supervision to improve quality and value for money across all specified supported housing provision." Councillor James Jameson, LGA chairman, said he was pleased that government is acting on council's concerns about the minority of unscrupulous landlords who exploit the supported housing system for financial gain while providing poor quality accommodation and support to people in vulnerable circumstances. And of course, LLG will report further on this as more details emerge.
Now, taken from the LGA Bulletin, I now turn to the situation facing children at the moment. We, of course, have the white paper, but in relation to SEND support, a recent Channel 5 programme explored the challenges facing the education system for children with special educational needs and disabilities. It spoke to parents wanting their child to go to a special school because they disagree with their council's assessment that there is mainstream provision which meets the child's needs. The LGA is quoted as saying that there is a tension between what parents want for their children and the support that can be provided. It said this fundamental imbalance should be addressed in the forthcoming SEND review. Turning to children in care, a study by the University of Bristol showed that 1 in 5 children in care in England were self-harming and likely to have mental ill health during the COVID-19 pandemic. Researchers surveyed more than 1,300 11 to 18-year-olds in care from 18 councils' areas in 2020 and 2021. The Children's Commissioner says that the COVID-19 inquiry's failure to address social services will ignore the children who were affected during the pandemic. The inquiry will examine the preparedness, capacity and resilience of the NHS, as well as the procurement of PPE, the impact of coronavirus on health staff, and the use of do not attempt resuscitation notices. Now, Dennis, your recent story about a witness giving evidence during a remote hearing while driving a van was, quite frankly, beyond belief. You're not seriously about to tell us that a judge did something similar?
Yes, I am, Helen. Not a van this time, but here's the story. A judge who conducted an actual hearing while driving his car has been given a formal warning for misconduct. Deputy District Judge Christopher McMurtry conducted a hearing in his car, partly while driving and using his phone in hands-free mode, the Judicial Conduct Investigations Office has said. The judge failed to meet the expectation to avoid conduct which might reduce respect for judicial office. The Lord Chief Justice Lord Burnett and Lord Chancellor Dominic Raab issued McMurtry with a formal warning for misconduct. No further details were provided about the nature of the hearing. In reaching their decision, they took into consideration that Judge McMurtry accepted that his decision to proceed with the hearing, after he had had to travel unexpectedly for personal reasons, was misguided, and he gave assurances as to his future conduct. As you rightly pointed out, this latest warning follows a judge's criticism last month of a witness who attempted to give evidence while driving a van. Are these cases just the tip of the iceberg? Is remote justice heading on a collision course, perhaps? Let's hope that this is the end of the road for cases like this.
Let's hope it's the end of the road for puns in the podcast, Dennis. Turning to the Employment Tribunal, in the case of Guardian News and Media against Rozanoff and others, the Employment Appeal Tribunal has ruled that journalists should be provided with documents in employment tribunal cases even after judgment has been handed down in a significant decision on open justice. The Guardian successfully argued that skeleton arguments, witness statements, and a number of other documents referred to in an employment tribunal judgment involving allegations of breaches of anti-money laundering regulations by Swiss bank EFG should be provided to the media. Judge James Taylor said the court at first instance adopted far too narrow an approach to the open justice principle, adding, material should be made available so that the judgment can properly be understood. And on that note, that's it for another edition of the podcast. Just a reminder that there is still time to nominate a team, person, or even yourself for our LLG Awards 2022. You can read more on that, the items discussed today, and many more besides by going to bulletin number 12, available on the LLG website now. So it's goodbye from me.
And from me too.
Thank you for listening. Have a good week.